Okay, so can I just, oh, thank you so much. Okay, so I'll go for 45 minutes from now.
Great.
All right, thank you very much for the kind words, Douglas, and thanks to Douglas and Anna, Ben, for organising this and inviting me. And I'm learning a hell of a lot, so it's really good. Thank you. I remember first went to a conference on panpsychism in 2010 in Vienna. Were you there, Benedict?
I think so.
And it was a sort of rare and unusual event. A conference on panpsychism is very, but it's really great that there are more and more such events happening these days, and it's really very much come much more into the mainstream, at least in analytic philosophy of mind in the last decade or so. So it's very exciting. Okay, so I want to talk about. Normally, I talk about a paper I haven't yet published. I might actually talk about a new book I have coming out that I've just sent off the final proofs for. So if anyone has any cutting objections, unfortunately, it's too late. But anyway, so this is coming out in November with Oxford University Press, called Why the Purpose of the Universe. And yeah, so basically the pictures are kind of pitched as a sort of middle way between traditional theism and traditional atheism. So, you know, everyone, I think with a lot of, if you think, oh, you have to fit into one of these two camps, you know, whose side are you on? Richard Dawkins or the Pope, you know, which, and I've slowly come to find deep difficulties in both of these options. Actually, I'm sure we'll come in the discussion to say, actually, whenever I talk about this to my atheist friends, they say, oh, what you're just talking about is non-standard atheism. And when I talk to my theist friends, as in lunch today, they say, oh, this is just non-standard theism. So, but anyway, I'm sure we can have lots of terminological disputes. But anyway, the way I'm setting up is that I've come to think traditional theism has a, have I written this wrong? I think I've written this wrong. I've written atheism twice. Traditional theism has a problem explaining evil and suffering, but also traditional atheism has problems with the fine-tuning of physics for life and psychophysical harmony. What's psychophysical harmony? I'll tell you in a moment. So what I'm doing in this book is arguing on this basis against both of these two options, and then exploring a few middle ground options. So I explore three hypotheses: non-standard designers, would be bad designer, an amoral designer, designer with limited abilities, not all powerful, or the simulation hypothesis, if you were in some computer simulation, or second hypothesis, teleological laws, such as Thomas Nagel entertained in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos. So laws of nature. There isn't a kind of conscious mind behind goal-directedness of the universe. There's just sort of laws of nature with goals built into them. And thirdly, which connects, I guess, with my prior work on panpsychism, cosmopsychism, the possibility that the universe is itself conscious and has certain goals. So I'm arguing for sort of some kind of goal-directedness, and trying to account for that in a way that avoids the problem of evil that arises for what sometimes called the omni-God, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. All right, so what I want to talk, that's just a bit of overview and advertisement, but what I want to make to is the consciousness chapter in this. So I'm arguing for cosmic goal-directedness on the basis of the fine-tuning of physics that people might have heard of, but also on the basis of psychophysical harmony. So this is what I introduce you to, the mystery of psychophysical harmony and how I try to address this. Okay, so psychophysical harmony is something I think maybe half a dozen philosophers are talking about at the moment, but I think it's going to change the world. It's my view. I think it's a problem that's difficult to get, and that's not because it's kind of technical or complicated. Rather, I think it's because it's suggesting we need to explain something which just seems such an obvious, mundane fact of everyday existence that it doesn't feel like it needs explaining. So I have an analogy in the book, you know, maybe if there were intelligent fish, they wouldn't feel the existence of water needs explaining because they're just swimming in it all the time. Or it also brings to mind George Orwell said, to attend to what is in front of one's nose requires constant effort. So I think there's something, whenever I talk to people about this, you're like, what are you talking about? This doesn't need explaining. We'll see what happens in a moment. Okay, so the basic thing that's at issue here is, the suggestion is we need to explain why conscious experiences and behavior tend to be paired together in a rationally appropriate way. So perhaps the most obvious examples are with pain and pleasure, that if something hurts, you tend to avoid it. If something feels good, all things being equal, you tend to pursue it. And I want to say this is a rational connection between experience and behavior. If something hurts, that gives you a reason to avoid it. So if you, in your behavior, you then do avoid it, your behavior is rational relative to the character of the experience. And conversely, if something feels good, that gives you a reason to pursue it. If you then do that, that's rational. Now, of course, this is only all things being equal. Obviously, a lot of the time, you'll persist through the pain of finishing a book, for example, some greater goal. The point is just that all things being equal, pain gives you some kind of pro tanto reason to avoid. And the connection between pain and avoidance behavior, pleasure and attraction behavior is too frequent to be coincidental. I don't think anyone would say it was coincidental. Okay, but there are lots of examples of this. When someone has a conscious visual experience that represents a chair in front of them, they tend to behave as though there's a chair in front of them. For example, sitting down if they want to have a rest, which is a rational way to behave in terms of like instrumental rationality. You know, that's a rational thing to do if you have that desire, and so on. Okay, so this is the basic thing. Now, as I say, people hear this, they what, this is bullshit. What do you this? If something hurts, you're going to avoid it. Why does that need explaining? But I suggest it does need it. I'm going to stand up actually. Right. Everyone else has sat down, but I sort of get a bit itchy. I want to suggest it does need explaining if, as for what it's worth, the majority of analytic philosophers of mind accept that there is no logical connection, no logical or conceptual connection between consciousness and behavior. So the way to kind of vividly introduce you to that point, introduce you to one of my imaginary friends, Inverted Ian, who I introduced to the world in a paper in Philosophical Quarterly in 2017. Okay, so Inverted Ian, that's all right, hates, but has a, in terms of his conscious experience, he has a strong revulsion and aversion to eating burgers, and he has a conscious yearning to have his body ripped apart by knives. But Inverted Ian lives in a strange possible world where the laws of nature are a bit wacky, and in Ian's universe, when you consciously yearn for something, that causes you to avoid it, and when you consciously repulsed by something, that causes you to go for it, to pursue it. So he ends up behaving just as someone would in our universe if they loved burgers and had a healthy disposition of getting their body ripped apart. Okay, so why the hell are we talking about this nonsense? This just seems kind of an absurd, typical philosopher's silly example. But I think it's important to think, so there is something absurd about this suggestion, but I think it's important to think carefully about what precisely is absurd about Inverted Ian. And I want to suggest that it's not a logical absurdity, right? There's stuff like incoherent, contradictory in the way a square circle is contradictory. And that's because, in my view, that there's no logical connection between how an experience feels and what it does, right? There's nothing contradictory in a revulsion for something causing you to go for it. Let's say people come across the Phil Paper's survey of English-speaking philosophers throughout the world, universities, asking them their philosophical opinions. Does God exist? Do we have free will? And so on. So on this question, striking 60% of philosophers agree with this. Well, think zombies are at least conceivable, if you've heard of philosophical zombies, which is basically equivalent to this statement. So that doesn't settle anything. It's not a popularity contest, but when 60% of philosophers agree on something, we should at least take note. Okay, so I think it's not a logical absurdity. What is the problem is that his experiences and his behavior are heard in a rationally appropriate way, so inappropriate way, right? If something feels good, that gives you a reason to pursue it. If something feels terrible, that gives you a reason to avoid it, and he's doing the precise opposite. So it's not a logical or conceptual absurdity, it's a rational absurdity. It's profoundly and bizarrely irrational. But if we just live in a fundamentally meaningless universe, where what stuff does is determined by mathematical laws of nature that don't care about what's rationally appropriate, then why should the behavior that conscious states produce respect norms of rationality, right? Why should that be? So I suggest it does need explaining that on the whole, there is this rationally appropriate connection between experience and behavior. So I mean, Ian inverted Ian is an obtuse example because he's the exact opposite of what's rationally appropriate. But I guess the more general question is just why should there be any sort of connection of rational appropriateness? Now, the next thing people always say on this, in my experience, is well, it's natural selection, isn't it? It's because we've evolved. Well, I don't think that answers it. I think if you think natural selection solves this problem, you haven't got the problem, which is fair enough because it's a sort of slightly confusing problem. Natural selection does not explain this because any evolutionary explanation already assumes an explanation of psychophysical harmony, and so can't thereby explain it on paper because then your explanations would be going around in a circle. So, the natural selection is only going to be interested in giving me, causing me to feel pain when my body's damaged, if I'm going to respond rationally to that pain by avoiding getting my body damaged. Right? But that's exactly what we're trying to explain, right? So whenever anybody gives them some kind of evil, so to be clear, I think we evolved our conscious experience and with the particular character it has. But I think we need to solve this philosophical problem to make sense of that. Or another way of putting it, right, inverted Ian would have survived just as well as us. Right? So if we were in his universe where when you have a conscious attraction to something, it causes you to avoid it, and conversely with conscious repulsion for something, then we would have evolved like him, right? So any evolutionary explanation already requires an answer to this. Okay, so that's basically the problem, but I find people are never convinced by it. I mean, I might just be wrong, but what I'll do now is just give you another way of explaining the problem. I think it perhaps is more vivid when we think about various specific theories in philosophy of mind. I think that you can see the problem comes out a bit more. So let's start off, let's just pretend David Chalmers style dualism is true. Here's a picture of young, wonderfully geeky David Chalmers. So he's a dualist, right? He thinks conscious states are fundamental and distinct from physical states of the body and the brain. So the conscious states are non-physical. So I guess a classic problem with dualism is if consciousness is non-physical, how does it connect so intimately with the physical brain? Chalmers postulates what he calls psychophysical laws of nature. So these are fundamental principles of nature over and above the laws of physics, which govern the causal relationship between the physical brain and non-physical consciousness. So he calls himself a naturalistic dualist. He doesn't want to think of it as something supernatural or spooky. He wants to bring it into the law-governed domain of science. So yeah, so this is supposed to explain why, if light bounces off the table, goes in my eyes, makes changes in my brain, and then those changes in my brain make changes in my non-physical consciousness. And it's these psychophysical laws that govern that connection. Or conversely, my pain, my non-physical pain, because pain is a conscious, causes changes in my brain, which makes me go, and run away. And that's, again, so the two-way interaction is governed by these psychophysical laws, right? So, okay, so just pretend that view is true, and now ask our question. So a question, or one form of this is, why does pain cause avoidance behavior? And that feels like a stupid thing to say, like, why does, when something hurts, why does that make people run away and avoid it? It feels like that's just trivial. Well, actually, once you think about the details of its view, it's not trivial. There is an answer to why pain causes avoidance behavior. It's just because of these psychophysical laws that in our universe govern the connection between the physical world and consciousness. They could have been different. If they could have been the psychophysical laws that obtain in inverted Ian's universe, and then we would have all evolved like inverted Ian. So you see, it's not, on this view at least, it's not trivial to ask why pain causes pain. Pain, it's because of these psychophysical laws. But then we get to our problem again. Well, why do these psychophysical laws that obtain in our universe respect norms of rationality? Right? Why do they make it the case that pain leads to avoidance behavior, which is rationally appropriate? Pleasure leads to attraction behavior, which again is rationally appropriate. How come these psychophysical laws of nature respect norms of rationality? Right? That seems like something that needs explaining. If we're just in this meaningless, godless universe, how come we have laws of nature that respect norms of rationality? Right, so you might say, well, I'm not a dualist, I'm a materialist. But I think actually, when you think about it, it's a little bit more subtle, but exactly the same problem is there for the materialist or the physicalist. Here's a picture of Esther Diaz-Leon, physicalist, friend of mine, sort of my philosophical nemesis and good friend, sort of the same career stage, and we sort of critique each other in work and so on. Some kind of political protest here. Okay, so let's just take, I think it applies to most forms of physicalism, but let's just take the simplest form of physicalism, a basic identity theory that just says conscious states just are physical patterns of neural firings, like water just is H2O, right? So there's not like two things in this bottle, the water and then the H2O. Water just is H2O. For this kind of physicalist, pain, the feeling of pain just is C fibers firing in the brain or something. This is the hackneyed example that came from Saul Kripke that philosophers always take when we were imagining what brain state pain is. They always say C fibers firing, which is empirically implausible, but it's just to give you a sort of simple example of one day neuroscientists discover this is the state that's perfectly correlated with pain. Okay, well, a quite common assumption is a contingentist view of the laws of nature, that the laws of nature, ultimately the laws of physics, are different in different possible, could have been different. We find the laws of physics with these equations, they could have been different. If that's right, then, okay, so we want to know, why does pain do what it does for a physicalist? Well, pain is C fibers firing, so that collapses into the question, why does C fibers firing do what it does? Well, that's ultimately because of the laws of nature, ultimately the laws of physics, right? So C fibers firing is this brain state. It does what it does because of the chemicals it's made of. The chemicals do what they do because of the atoms because of the particles, and the particles do what they do ultimately because of the laws of physics, right? So ultimately, C fibers firing, which is pain, does what it does because of the laws of physics, which could have been different. Okay, so again, we find it's not trivial to ask, how come pain causes you to avoid things? You know, it feels like it's true, but it's not. There's an answer to it. Pain is C5 is firing, and that does what it does because of the laws of physics. If the laws of physics had been different, pain wouldn't have caused avoidance behavior. So again, we get this problem. How come the laws of nature, in this case, the laws of physics, how come the laws of physics end up ensuring this rational connection between consciousness and behavior? How come the laws of physics respect norms of rationality? Wasn't supposed to be like that, right? Okay, so try and speed up a little bit. All right, so that just to summarize, the problem is something that seems so trivial. When something hurts, you avoid it. This actually, I think, on any view, needs explaining. How come that's rationally appropriate? How come the behavior that goes associated with consciousness is rationally appropriate? Actually, well, there is one view that avoids this problem. I think one and only view, a quite radical form of physicalism, associated, for example, with David Lewis, very influential philosopher. He died in 2001, I think. Called analytic functionalism. So this is the quite radical view that conscious states are just defined in terms of what they do. They're just defined in terms of behavior, right? Whether external behavior or behavior. Well, I'll get to that. So the way to understand this view, I always like to give the analogy of poison. You know, poison is just defined by what it does. We call something poison if it kills you when you ingest it, right? That's just what we mean by poison. Similarly, for the analytic functionalists, what we mean by pain, right? If I say my wife's in pain, what I mean is something roughly like a state which causes avoidance behavior in response to bodily damage. It's just defined by what it does. So this is not just a metaphysical claim, it's a claim about meaning, what we mean by our words. Just to be clear, because it's not just external behavior, but also maybe behavior between bits inside your brain, for example. So it's about the causal connection, but it's just defined in terms of what it does. So this would just avoid the problem, right? If pain is just defined in terms of avoidance behavior, then obviously there's nothing to explain here. Just as poison is just defined as killing you when you ingest it. There's no puzzle of, oh, how come all the poison kills people? It's like, we wouldn't call it poison, right? Poison by definition. So if you define conscious states in terms of behavior, the problem goes away. Okay, but I don't, like many philosophers, I just don't find this a plausible view. I don't find this plausible that that's what we mean. You know, when I say my wife's in pain and I'm bothered about that, I'm not making a claim about her behavior or the behavior of her inner parts. I'm making a claim about how she feels. And that seems a very different kind of claim. I wouldn't be bothered if it was just about the behavior of her inner parts. It's about how she feels, which seems like a very different kind of claim. So again, going back to Phil Papers, about 16% of philosophers are analytic functions. It's not quite probably in the same ballpark as panpsychism. Anyway, so at least this is an interesting thing because it's, you know, it sounds like, as I say, it sounds like a trivial problem. Why does pain cause you to avoid things? But actually, only on this most radical form of physicalism do you avoid the problem. Okay, that's the problem. So where does this lead us? So I want to suggest, this leads us to a choice, right? Assuming we're not going to go for analytic functionalism, either it's just a wild fluke that conscious experience and behavior are paired together in a rationally appropriate way, or there is some kind of directedness towards rationality somehow built into reality at the fundamental level. And I suggest A is just wildly improbable, and so not something we should take seriously. Sometimes get sort of new atheist type thinking. I'm brave enough to face the improbable, but it's not brave, it's irrational to believe improbable things. So I conclude on this basis that we've got very good reason to think that there is some kind of directedness towards rationality somehow built into reality at the fundamental level that ensures that there is this rationally appropriate connection between consciousness and behavior. One way of suggesting this, one way of making sense of this is theism, right? So two very good Christian philosophers, Dustin Crummett and Brian Cutter, have a paper, psychophysical harmony, so it should be, a new argument for theism, and their solution to this is they think David Chalmers' style dualism is true, and God has set up the psychophysical laws. They could have been different, but God set them up to ensure that consciousness and behavior are paired together in a rationally appropriate way. So that's one way in which rationality can be built into the universe by a rational mind being behind it. So I'm not a huge fan of that possibility because of the problem of evil. I've debated both of these people on a lot of YouTube in these days on various YouTube channels. But anyway, it's an excellent paper, though, a very rigorous presentation of the problem. So what I defend instead, I mean, I sort of, in my book, Galileo, my last book, Galileo's Error, I sort of vaguely introduced this position, but it's much more worked out in this new book. I defend what I call, as an alternate, Pan-Agentialism, which is roughly the idea that just matter is inherently rational. So it's not that there's a rational mind behind the universe. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't, that would just be another question. I'm just saying matter itself has a basic disposition to respond rationally to the character of its experience. Okay, so this is why when people feel pain, they tend to avoid it because that's a rational response. And as physical creatures, conscious physical creatures, we are disposed to respond rationally to the character of our experience. So you might think, okay, that sounds plausible for human beings, maybe higher organisms, but what about kind of particles? So this is a form of panpsychism, where there is rudimentary experience with the fundamental physical entities, maybe fundamental particles, maybe universe-wide fields, as many theoretical physicists tend to think of the fundamental building blocks of our universe. So you might think, okay, it's one thing to say they have rudimentary experience, but that they can respond rationally, that they have rationally appropriate responses. So what I say when it comes to these basic physical entities, I ascribe to them proto-agency. Actually, the publisher maybe change it to agency to proto-agency, so a little bit more palatable. But so the idea is that an electron, right, although it has conscious experience, it can't rationally deliberate, it has no conscious understanding of the universe around it, and so it is only capable of the most basic rational response: do what you feel like doing. So I think that is a rational response. If you feel like doing something, one rational response is to do it. That gives you a reason to do it. But of course, if you're a normally functioning human being, that's just one rational response, right? So you feel like eating the chocolate, but you might think, well, I'm on a diet, or I don't ethically approve of milk or something, and you weigh up these things. Whereas if you've ever experienced young children, if they want something, tend to go and get it. So the idea is particles are like that, right? They have a disposition like all physical entities on this view to respond rationally, but because they don't know anything, they have no understanding, no rational deliberation, they're inevitably going to respond with the simplest rational response: do what you feel like doing. And this is why, on this view, we get a predictable world, because the particles have predictable inclinations, conscious inclinations, and they're inevitably going to respond to their inclinations and behave in a very predictable way. Okay, so why take this seriously? So the idea is, I think once this view is in place, all we need is natural selection, right? Because once it's in place that this physical entities just have a basic disposition to respond rationally to the character of experience, well, when by chance there happen to emerge some simple forms of conscious understanding of the world around in an organism, then that organism is going to respond rationally to that simple conscious understanding and behave well, survive better by behaving well, by responding through their behavior, responding rationally to their simple understanding of the world around them, and they're going to survive better. So with this in place, natural selection has a reason to want to create organisms with rich conscious understanding of the world around them, because they're going to respond rationally to that and survive well. Okay, so in the absence of this, I suggest it's a total mystery why there's this wonderful harmony between experience and behavior. Once this is in place, all we need then is natural selection, right? So that's my explanation of this. So, I mean, ultimately, this is a Bayesian argument. So this is a principle that can be derived from Bayes' theorem, that if the evidence is more likely assuming theory A is true than it is assuming theory B is true, then the evidence supports theory A over theory B. So then the premise would be, well, if God or Pan-Agentialism or something like this is true, then psychophysical harmony is not so improbable. It's to be expected. Whereas if we live in what I call in the book an irrational universe, where the laws of nature don't care, as it were, about rational considerations, then psychophysical harmony is incredibly improbable. We can just derive logically from these three premises that we have very strong evidence for either God or Pan-Agentialism. I prefer one of those options over the other, but okay. So finally, well, maybe I'll have a different response from this audience, but often this talk defending this wacky Pan-Agentialist view, you know, people are kind of skeptical. I just want to end with a sort of methodological reflection. So I find a lot of times people are skeptical because people feel that they're open to sort of wacky sounding views if there's strong empirical data in support of them. You know, people are happy to embrace special relativity or the weirdness of quantum mechanics, you know, time slowing down when you travel far, if there's hard data in support of it. But if it's just some philosophical arguments, there's a suspicion, you know, you can't prove that much of just abstract arguments. Well, I actually respect that methodological intuition. I think you shouldn't believe radical theories of reality without hard data. But what I would add to that is that the consciousness is itself hard data. It's just not the sort of data you get from public observation and experiments, right? So I think we're going through a very scientific period of history where, you know, people are so blown away by the success of natural science that they think, that's it, that's the full story. The only way we can find out about reality, the only data is public observation experiments. Consciousness is not known about in that way. I can't cut open Douglas's head and see his feelings and experiences. We know about consciousness in a very different way. It's not something we discovered down a particle collider. We know about consciousness because we're immediately aware of our own experiences, right? So it's not data from observation experiments, but it's real. And it's arguably known better than anything we know from experiments. The reality of consciousness is hard data. And the data I'm appealing to here, which is, I mean, I guess it's a striking correlation between behavior that we can observe and consciousness, the character of consciousness as we know it from the inside. What I want to say that striking correlation is bloody hard data, as hard as the data that underpins special relativity or quantum mechanics. I mean, you might dispute the moves I've made from the data to the theory, but the data is solid. So I think that should open us up to taking seriously. You might still disagree with the argument, but you should, at a methodological level, you should be opened up to the possibility that this case is strong, because I would argue it is appealing to very, very hard data and really spelling out the implications of that data. Okay, sorry, I've gone on too long, but I'd love to know what you think.
It was extremely rich and a very engaging presentation. So thoughts? What is?
Yeah, well, I'm not sort of surprised by the questions you ask. I think, I mean, from the point of view of the tradition, philosophical tradition, I'm immersed in that. That's completely normal. I mean, I would even think that there are even more important questions, like why the universe doesn't stop existing just like that. Which
So
is,
what are you not surprised by? The questions I'm
the
asking?
question, the question. I think it's a good question, but I think you stop too soon in this exploration, because, for instance, you don't. Well, of course, that's a part of your argument, I guess, but you don't answer a question: why? I mean, what is rationality, and why does anyone do anything? I mean, because you describe a situation when someone does anything, right? So there is some action towards something. Why? Of course, within the tradition I'm speaking from, you would introduce, I mean, you would explain that only by referring to the idea of the good. So to be rational is to, because you use this term, to be rational means to go towards things which are good and avoid things which are evil. And pain is just a signal that something evil is present. Pleasure is a signal that something good is. So within this tradition, we wouldn't say that pain makes someone avoid it, but that both pain and avoidance are just signs on this level, that on a higher level there is an awareness that something evil is present, and rational beings avoid evil. So I think that's interesting, because this is a language which I don't use, and this is interesting to me to see how you deal with very good questions, which should be asked. But I would introduce other terms like good and evil, because then you seem to assume some moral order, but you don't spell out this. And even Thomas Nagel in Mind and Cosmos speaks about values, right? So,
Yeah.
but you try to sort of put those values aside for a while, and you treat pain and pleasure as sort of morally neutral things. Like, so you don't say that pursuing pleasure is something morally good and avoiding evil something morally bad on a rudimentary level, which it is in fact. But you try to on this very morally neutral level, try to figure out why does any organism avoid. So I'm interested in what you do, even though I have those reservations.
Thank you. I think there might be less disagreement than you think. I mean, some on the first point you're making about, you know, do we need to explain why the universe doesn't stop in the next minute? I mean, I suppose I think everyone has to stop somewhere. You know, Wittgenstein said explanation. I don't like a lot of what Wittgenstein says, but I do like explanations have to end somewhere. So, you know, whether you stop with God or the Big Bang or mathematics, or, you know, you have to stop somewhere. And so it doesn't seem to be anything necessarily problematic as far as it goes with the material. It's just saying that there's this physical universe and these causal principles, and that from that starting point it entails that the universe carries on and so on. Or maybe you start with a quantum vacuum and certain internal principles. I mean, I guess we'll run into the cosmological argument at some point, but the problem with stopping with what I call an irrational picture of nature is just that we end up with this wild fluke that behavior and consciousness are rationally appropriately connected. So that's not a good stopping point. Very reasonably, that's not a good stopping point. But yeah, I don't think I want to say they're morally neutral. I mean, or at least they're not value neutral. I think, yeah, pain. I certainly want to think, you know, pain gives you a reason to avoid, and I mean reason in a fully value-laden sense there. Like it's.
So what's the reason? or avoiding pain, according to you?
Yeah, so well, because it's bad, yeah, I'd be happy to say because it's bad.
And why is it bad?
So I guess so. I mean, well, I'm roughly a Platonist about values or something. So I mean, yeah, you need to make sense of. I'm assuming some value objectivity here, which I acknowledge in chapter 1 is about the foundations of value and so on. I mean, I don't have any particular worked out theory. Yeah, I guess I can see the motivation for some form of Platonism to underpin facts about value, because facts about value are necessarily true. So it seems to me that you're gonna need something that exists necessarily, like platonic forms and so on. I guess I would resist the move to thinking that you need God rather than Platonism, but yeah, so I would stop at Platonism.
But I'm just slightly conscious of the time, so we've got Benny and Denis.
One on Zoom.
Sorry?
One on Zoom.
And one on two. Yeah, okay, so. Is it? Yes, Benny first and then Denis.
I can hold off to
Yeah,
the
okay.
time you're talking afterwards.
Yeah, thanks for your paper and argument. Well, actually, I've got many questions, but I'm discussing. So, I mean, would you say that matter could also not have been inherently rational?
Yeah, well, there could have been a kind of matter. I mean, I don't want to get too pedantic. I don't know whether this matter might be essentially rational, but yes, there could have been a kind of matter that wasn't inherently rational. Yes.
And why is it inherently rational then?
Yeah, well, coming back to the last question, I suppose everyone has to stop somewhere. I mean, even if if you stop at God, you could say, this sort of supremely rational mind. Let's say, you say, well, why is there a supremely rational mind rather than a hobbit or something? I don't know, you won't, or nothing. So I think you've got to stop somewhere. So I don't have a problem with the materialist, anyone else. You've got to stop somewhere. So that's just my stopping point. Is that we live in this universe with matter that's disposed to respond rationally to the character of its experience. That would be my stopping point.
Yeah, but I mean, I can see some scholastics or whoever objecting that they stop too early in the explanation.
Why?
Well, I mean, if the universe, if it is a contingent fact that the universe is, or the matter is inherently rational, and basically you would say, well, I assume that it is a brute fact.
That's so.
And I would say, well, but the question, if there are or be infinitely many other alternatives, that matter would have been not inherently rational at all, or differently rational, maybe. I don't know, probably there's some conceptual group. Then that calls for a cause that transcends the universe and accounts for the rationality for the contingent fact. So I think the theist would say, well, that's a bit, just come on outside.
So we're getting into the cosmological argument, aren't we?
Yeah.
I suppose I just think this argument applies. I don't see why God gets a free pass on this. Even if we get to God, we could say, well, there could have been nothing, or there could have been just a material universe, or there could have been, and unless the ontological argument works, you don't get a satisfactory explanation, which I don't think it does. I mean, I do talk about this in the book as well, and I think so. Even if you think on cosmological argument type reasoning, there must be some self-explainer or necessary being. I suggest that you could think that the quantum vacuum was a self-explaining necessary being, and that would be the more parsimonious view rather than postulating something outside of. But probably a big discussion because I don't think even if God is the fundamental self-explaining being, I don't think we understand. Unless the ontological argument works, we understand why God explains her own existence, and so any more than we understand why a quantum vacuum could explain its existence. So anyway.
Well, that's the ontological argument does work.
I'm happy, so I'll try to be brief, but my question comes
We
from.
don't get the Zoom question as well.
Yeah.
I will try to be brief then. So my question comes from a similar place, but a different place than the two other questions. And I'm glad you went into the ontological argument, because I'd like to begin with something you said at the very beginning of your paper, which was goal directedness. One way you can describe what you're calling a proto agency, if I remember correctly, is goal directedness, even at the level of particle physics, right? Now, one way we can think of goal directedness in terms of philosophical terminology is teleology, quite simply. And so if you want to maintain teleology, but to remove any kind of particular, let's say, moral telos or ontological telos from the end, well, then you have a form of teleology without telos. Or as Immanuel Kant said, right, rejecting the ontological argument, purposiveness without purpose. So you can create a world in which you have teleology and you have teloi, so various ends that drive your behavior in the world, but they serve a regulative schematic purpose in the world without having any kind of epistemological value per se, right? It has, you could say, axiomatic value and giving a sense of purpose in reality, but maybe not a kind of scientific knowledge in the same claim. So this is a preface all to ask my question, which is, I found your presentation very fascinating, and it starts off with philosophy of mind and then really turns into cosmology. And I didn't want to ask about morals, but I was thinking about teleology, but I wanted to think about ethics, because the way in which what we could think about is teleology is fundamentally, regardless if you think of the telos of evil or the telos of good, you do have teleology in ethics. You're asking even a kind of ethical response of the voluntarism of particle physics, explaining why the particles behave in the world the way they behave is, in the way you're asking, is very much analogous to an ethical question. And so I was wondering more broadly about the teleology of ethics. I mean, I smuggled in the cosmology at the end, but what kind of teleology do you have in ethical agency if one does not introduce either the fiat of theism, the fiat of absolute good and evil, or the fiat of a kind of cosmological rationality?
Thanks. That's very great questions, everybody. So I think I want to say the particle does have a kind of teleology in the sense that it's aiming at rationality. It's disposed to. So I don't think it has any sort of conscious understanding of ultimate rational principle or something, but it's disposed, and in that to respond rationally. And so in that sense, maybe something not too dissimilar to Aristotle thinking that the human essence is rationality, but so the particle essence is disposed to respond rationally. And what is rationality? I mean, it's ultimately, I suppose, at either the theoretical or the practical level, responding to facts about value. And that's flourishes in human beings in a much richer sense. We have a much more rich availability of rational responses. But as I say, in the particle, because it's so simple, it can just do what it feels like doing. But I want to say that is a rational response, because it does give you a reason to do it. If it feels good, that gives you a reason to do it. So I would say that the particle has the telos of rationality, not necessarily something consciously apprehended, but it is naturally disposed to respond rationally.
The final will have to be very brief indeed, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, we can.
Hello. Hi, Philip. Thank you very much indeed for your talk. And just as a quick preliminary to my question, I just want to say I started a module on panpsychism at the University of Munich 2 years ago. And for the last 2 semesters, we've been reading Galileo's Error. So that's been very exciting. I also thought, so your idea about, I'm certainly very sympathetic to your idea about locating purpose in, I suppose, physical being in a sense. I also found it very interesting because, in fact, I have a publication coming out next month in Philosophische Forschung, on which basically articulates essentially the same thing, but from a more continental perspective. Yeah, very, very interesting. Maybe it has to do with the fact that I've been reading your book for the last 2 semesters. But I wanted to ask then, so my question is, do you think that sometimes we don't take philosophy of science seriously enough? And that comes from the perspective of that. I know that, you know, there's the topic of intrinsic natures, which we articulate, and we locate experience within that which we cannot access, let's say, which in philosophy of science, of course, is epistemic structural realism, right? And it kind of occurred to me over the last couple of semesters that, yeah, a lot of this work assumes that epistemic structural realism is correct, but there's a lot of critique of this view in contemporary philosophy of science. It's like ontic realism and you know, or sorry, ontic structuralism and so on, and of course scientific realism as well, and such kind of ideas. But I think mostly Eddington's work as well, which is kind of somewhere between ontic structuralism and epistemic structuralism. And I just kind of think, I wonder, or I would like to know your thoughts. Is it something that we should maybe look at more? Those debates in philosophy of science.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And email me your paper. It sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an important objection to the, you know, Russellian panpsychist position that couldn't there just be pure structure? Isn't that a coherent position? Actually, I can't ignore this because many of my colleagues at Durham defend this, like Stephen Mumford. So there are arguments that go back to Russell that I defend that you get in a sort of vicious circularity with just causal structure, because sort of everything's defined in terms of everything else. And Russell said it's like everyone's doing everyone else's washing. And then who was it who retorted, well, as long as the washing gets done. But anyway, it's a very tricky argument to get, you know, it never sort of goes anywhere. But I think the more pressing way to object to pure causal structuralism is just to argue you wouldn't get consciousness in such a world. You know, if it was just pure causal structure, you're not going to get subjective experience with the qualities we enjoy in subjective experience. So we know that even if there is a coherent possible universe with just causal structure, we know we're not living in it because we're conscious. So, and of course, there's a huge debate there, and we have to have the argument, but that would be the fundamental way I would try to reject that position. And of course, this is not something philosophers of science generally ever think about, right? Nor metaphysicians in their tradition. They're not thinking about consciousness. They're just thinking about the data of observation experiments. That's not the only data. There's another data point we need to accommodate. So that's how I.
On that note, I think I'm going to bring this to a conclusion.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you.
So let's thank Philip for an absolutely wonderful presentation.